Hello everybody and welcome to this video, which is kindly sponsored by Squarespace. Today we're going to be adding an article to the web page. So as you can see here, I'm going to manage section and I'm going to add an article so I can put in the title. In this case, I'm going to use my script from the development of depth charges. And of course, since I already have the script, I can just paste it into the text section and hit save. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is that then when you go back to the articles, it's still not there, because if you go into managing the section again, you can see it's a draft, so it's not visible yet. So you can have all of this ready and partially edited, but it doesn't have to be visible. But obviously put a little cover photo on, and then, well, the text is pretty much ready to go. But hey, let's include a picture, shall we? So you'll notice that the text has automatically split itself into paragraphs, so I can hit a plus, add a picture, in this case a U-boat net, and it comes with a handy little caption feature as well, so I can put whatever caption I want. And obviously all this is happening still without the article being published, so if I did want to come back and do further revisions, then I could. But once I've put in this caption, I think it's time to get this published, so then I just go up to publish, and it's live. So if after all these little mini tutorials I've been doing, you think you could build a website for maybe ideally naval history purposes, but you never know, you might want to do it for some other reason, then head over to squarespace.com/Drakenfell. You can get a free trial, and once you're ready, that little link will give you 10% off your first website or domain. So thanks once again to Squarespace for sponsoring the video, and on with the main show. So to wrap up the frigate duels of the War of 1812 series, I thought we could have a quick look at what happened to all the ships and captains that were directly involved after those duels were completed. Now, where a ship or captain took part in more than one duel, I'll leave it to their last duel in order to mention them. So, working in chronological order. HMS Guerriere, captained by James Dacre, was considered too badly damaged to be salvaged in the aftermath of her duel with USS Constitution. As such, the crew was taken off and the ship was set on fire the day after the battle. Captain Dacre was acquitted in his court-martial for the loss of the ship on the grounds of her poor condition and lightweight construction, as well as evidence that he and his crew had done their utmost in the face of the enemy. He went on to be given command of the large frigate HMS Tiber and the third-rate HMS Edinburgh before finishing his career as Admiral of the Cape of Good Hope station. One of his sons, named after his father, also went into the Navy and would eventually die aboard HMS Nimrod while undertaking anti-slavery patrols. Isaac Hull, captain of the USS Constitution in its battle with the Guerriere, went on to command the Portsmouth Navy Yard in Maine for the rest of the War of 1812, supervising the construction of several new ships and upgrading the yard. He then served on the Board of Navy Commissioners before taking up command of what is now the Boston Navy Yard. Then in the 1820s he captained the frigate USS United States in the Pacific, before taking command of the Washington Navy Yard, and then finishing his career as commander of the US Navy's European Squadron aboard USS Ohio, a rare US ship of the line that actually had a somewhat active service life. USS United States spent the rest of the War of 1812 blockaded in by superior British forces, and toward the latter stages the ship was actually disarmed and the guns and her crew sent to the Great Lakes to help out over there. Soon after the end of the war, she was rearmed and dispatched as part of the US forces sent to suppress the Barbary pirates in the Second US-Barbary War, after which she'd spent most of the rest of the first half of the 19th century on active duty, or in refit to go back on active duty after long periods at sea. This was until 1849, when she was placed in reserve one last time. She was still there in 1861 when Confederate forces advanced onto what is now Norfolk Navy Yard, where she was partially sunk by retreating Union forces. The Confederate states subsequently pumped her out and used her as a harbour defence vessel for some time before sinking her again, this time as an obstruction in the Elizabeth River, where she would eventually be salvaged from towards the end of the war. HMS Macedonian was taken into US Navy service after her capture, and as USS Macedonian, she remained with USS United States blockaded in port. but was also sent to the Barbary War immediately after the end of said war, and she went on to have a very active service life until the mid-1820s, when she was found to be rather worn out by over a decade of constant activity, and was subsequently decommissioned and broken up in 1828. Her captain at the time of her capture, John Carden, did not receive as favourable a court-martial as Dacre. Although he was technically acquitted, the Royal Navy never allowed him to serve at sea again. He spent long periods on half pay until he was eventually retired in 1836. HMS Java was, like Guerriere, considered too badly damaged to take as a prize after her battle with USS Constitution and was burned 2 days after her surrender. Captain Henry Lambert had been mortally wounded by an American sharpshooter and died about a week after his ship was lost. Captain Bainbridge, who was in charge of USS Constitution that day, would spend the rest of his life bouncing between Navy yards and active commands. Taking the chance to work on the Boston Navy Yard while he was blockaded there, he would subsequently lead some of the US forces in the Second Barbary War, command the ship-of-the-line USS Columbus, and oversee the fitting out of the ship-of-the-line USS North Carolina, serving in the Boston and Philadelphia Navy Yards in between these periods. USS Chesapeake was taken into Royal Navy service after her capture as HMS Chesapeake, serving on the Halifax station towards the end of the war, but the Royal Navy was never especially happy with her sailing qualities, and she was sold for breaking up in 1819, whereupon large sections of the ship were sold to one John Pryor of Wickham, Hampshire in England, and these were used to construct a large watermill just to the northwest of Portsmouth, which is still standing today and arguably actually contains the single largest amount of intact timbers from any of the War of 1812 vessels, as they've remained in place and unaltered ever since their installation. Her captain at the time of her capture, James Lawrence, died while his ship was en route to Halifax following said capture. HMS Shannon, Chesapeake's opponent, was taken in for repairs and remained in reserve after these were complete. After several refits and modernizations, she would eventually go to sea again for a few years between 1828 and 1831, after which she became a receiving ship at Sheerness, a role in which she remained until 1859, when she was broken up at Chatham. Her captain, Philip Broke, became a gunnery specialist after partial recovery from the head wound inflicted in the capture of Chesapeake, and he would remain on active Royal Navy service until his death in 1841. USS Essex was taken back to the UK after her capture and became HMS Essex, but was never used as an active duty frigate. She was instead redesignated as a troop ship in 1819 while still in the reserves, before becoming a prison ship off of various Irish ports until 1837, when she was sold for breaking up. Her captain, David Porter, was returned to the USA, where he was given command of the brig USS Firefly and was to lead a squadron of similar ships in an effort to disrupt Caribbean trade. But the war ended before the ships could sail. He then served on the Board of Commissioners until 1822, after which he went to sea, ironically enough to try and wipe out the last Caribbean pirates, but due to the unsanctioned attack that he conducted on a Spanish colony during the course of these operations, he was censured and resigned, serving instead as the head of the Mexican Navy for the rest of the 1820s. After this, somewhat improbably, he entered the diplomatic service, where he would die in 1843 whilst on assignment to the Ottoman Empire. HMS Phoebe, the lead ship in the capture of the Essex, sailed back to the UK with her prize, where she was paid off until after the end of the war. After a brief period of service, she became a receiving ship in 1823, then a hulk in 1826 based in Plymouth, before being broken up in 1841. Her captain, James Hillier, remained in active Royal Navy service, eventually moving up to command the third-rate HMS Revenge and then the large first-rate HMS Caledonia, reaching flag rank in 1837 and passing away while still in naval service in 1843. HMS Cherub went on to recapture a number of Essex's prizes before escorting a convoy back to the UK, where she was refitted and then dispatched to the West Africa Squadron, spending the rest of the 1810s on anti-slavery patrols, during which time she either captured or helped capture 3 slave ships. It seems that she was quite worn out by this service, as she was then sold for breaking up at the start of 1820. Her captain, Thomas Tudor Tucker, briefly commanded the Andromeda and then the Comus, but with the conclusion of the Napoleonic Wars he went on half pay, where he remained until he retired in 1846. USS President was taken back to the UK via Bermuda, incurring some storm damage along the way, and was recommissioned as HMS President. She was repaired and briefly employed in British service, but by 1818 she was found to be rotten, most likely from the significant water ingress through shot holes between her capture and refit, and so she was condemned for breaking up, although not before a detailed survey was taken so that a copy could be built, which was then frequently employed on the North America station, where she would often be met by USS Macedonian, the successor of the captured ship, and built with some of her materials. President's captain, Stephen Decatur, had previously commanded the USS United States in her capture of HMS Macedonian, and subsequent to the loss of the President would take command of the other squadron that was sent to the Second Barbary Wars, the first being commanded by Bainbridge. After the successful conclusion of this campaign, he would serve on the Board of Navy Commissioners until 1820, and in this role he strongly resisted the reinstatement of James Barron, who'd commanded the Chesapeake in the Chesapeake Leopard affair before the War of 1812. But he cast such loud aspersions on Barron's character that the latter felt he had no choice but to challenge him to a duel. Decatur had, however, failed to make all that many friends. Barron's second hated him, and Decatur chose Bainbridge as his second after another man that he asked declined the role. It turned out that Bainbridge seems to have been none too fond of Decatur either, and the two seconds arranged for a duel with conditions that resulted in Barron being badly wounded, and Decatur fatally so. HMS Endymion, which had crippled President, was repaired but then kept in reserve until 1833, before returning to active service in a variety of theatres, which included seeing quite active service in the First Opium War, before eventually becoming a receiving ship in Plymouth in 1859 and being broken up in 1868. Her last captain on active duty was George Lambert, the younger brother of Captain Henry Lambert of HMS Java. Her captain at the time of President's capture, Henry Hope, would go on half pay at the end of the war until 1831, when he became naval aide-de-camp to King William IV and subsequently to Queen Victoria, ascending up the ranks until he reached the rank of Admiral in 1858. HMS Cyane became USS Cyane upon her return to the USA after her capture, and after some repairs and a brief period in the reserves, she spent 1819 to 1821 operating in an anti-slavery role off the West African coast, before seeing service in the Mediterranean and off Brazil. In 1828 she was back in the Philadelphia Navy Yard, where she remained in reserve until she sank at her moorings in 1835 and was broken up the following year. Her captain at the time of capture, Gordon Falcon, was honourably acquitted for the loss of his ship and subsequently went on to command the frigates HMS Tyne and Isis being quite a large example of the type, then the 74-gun Spartiate, the similar HMS Wellesley, and then the first-rate HMS San Josef, which was captured by Nelson at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, and then another smaller ship of the line, the Royal Adelaide. He left her in 1836 to serve as the supervisor of Pembroke Dock in Wales, and then moved on to command the royal yacht HMS Royal Sovereign, retiring in 1848. HMS Levant was recaptured by HMS Acasta and remained in Royal Navy service briefly before being laid up with the end of the Napoleonic Wars. She would be broken up in 1820. Her captain, George Douglas, was also honourably acquitted for the loss of his ship and went on half pay with the end of the Napoleonic Wars, apparently taking up a second job in the 1830s as a tax commissioner. Their opposition in that particular battle was led by Captain Charles Stewart, who would go on to lead the US Mediterranean Squadron from 1816 to 1820, and then the Pacific Squadron from 1820 to 1824. However, his career at sea was disrupted by a court-martial caused by his conduct off Peru during that country's war for independence against Spain, although by the mid-1830s he was back at sea operating against slave ships, before returning ashore to periodically command the Philadelphia Navy Yard, becoming the senior-most US Navy officer in 1851, before eventually retiring in 1861, and due to being age 83 at the time, he was not recalled for service in the American Civil War, but he did manage to reach the grand old age of 91 instead. And speaking of long life, that brings us to our final ship. Having seen victory in 3 separate frigate duels, USS Constitution went on to serve in the US Navy's Mediterranean Squadron, having missed the Second Barbary War due to being under refit. She would serve in this role until 1828, when she was placed in reserve, where she was neglected and rapidly decayed. She was almost broken up in 1830, but public outcry saved her and she was repaired and instead served in the Mediterranean and Pacific squadrons subsequently until 1842, when she once again went into reserve. Refitted, she made a round-the-world cruise in 1844, arriving home in late 1846, going back into reserve for her refit before heading out to the Mediterranean in late 1848, and then back into reserve for most of 1851 and 1852, after which she was sent to the African Squadron, ending her last tour of frontline duty in 1855. In 1857, she was turned into a training ship for the US Naval Academy and was moved north to avoid danger from the Confederates in the American Civil War, returning to Annapolis at the end of the conflict. Here she remained until 1871, when she was overhauled to take part in the USA's centennial celebrations, but she was still being refitted when the event occurred. Instead, she was put back into service as an active sailing training ship, but by 1881 she had decayed again and was put to use as a receiving ship. In 1905, the Secretary of the Navy suggested using the old ship for target practice, which sparked off such a storm of public anger that she was instead partially restored to her original condition and turned into a museum ship. But, with funds running short, she continued to decay until she was in danger of structural collapse. Luckily, a public fundraising effort was topped up by Congress and the badly rotted ship went through extensive reconstruction in the 1920s, ironically at pretty much the same time as the similarly decayed HMS Victory was also being restored. She sailed in 1931, toured the country, and then settled into her new life as a museum ship in Boston Harbor. She was extensively refitted again in the mid-1970s, this time getting out of dry dock in time for the USA's bicentennial celebration, and she would be refitted once more in 1995, furthering efforts to get her back to her War of 1812 configuration, and this put her in good enough shape to sail under her own power in 1997. She now resides in Boston as the second oldest commissioned warship in the world, and the oldest commissioned warship still afloat.